We're going to go at breakneck pace. I've already told you in the plenary that Strauss and Howe became enormously useful for me. You'll notice on the back page of this document that's not out yet is a bibliography. And this bibliography has given, this is essentially 20 years of what I have found to be the most useful reading on the subjects that we're going to carry. And again, the goal of generations theory as it applies to the church is to build parishes and congregations of grace, of sanctuary, in which people can be fully embraced for what time has given them to bring to the table. That means that any congregation that becomes good at understanding generational dynamics will have the same mantra. We aim to keep everyone happy part of the time. Because we can't keep everybody happy all the time. That's the point. Each generation has such different experiences and expectations that it is quite simply impossible to do that. Generations theory gives us a way to talk about church stuff so that when something's happening in the room that doesn't meet my needs, I can rejoice that the needs of another person is being met in that room. And I might be intelligently informed about what those needs might be and who those persons might be. And it has been, as you'll hear in a little bit later in my own story, enormously useful in my own ministry. How many of you have had any training in generations theory, Strauss and Howe style? Oh, so some, but not many. This is 20 years old now. Went through a period where everywhere I went, everyone had heard about it. So let me begin at the beginning and talk very quickly. I've mentioned to you already how I got into it. I just picked it up out of fun and then began to apply it in the life of the church. Strauss and Howe say that there are 4 kinds of generations. These generations are civic, adaptive, idealist, and reactive. They say that these types of generations have repeated in the same order with one exception through the U.S. history. And what is that exception? Civil War. The Civil War tweaked generations for that brief time period. So guess what? By understanding the past, we might make some reasonable prediction about what's coming next. And if your denomination is like mine, and I suspect we are more alike than either of us realize, we have been in the Presbyterian Church not so much a conservative institution as a preservative institution. You know, we've never done it that way before. Have you ever heard that at a vestry meeting? Generations theory gives us a way to understand time so that we can begin to embrace change and embrace time as our friend. We develop a natural ease with those who experience the same formative events at similar developmental phases. And this is common sense, but yet it had to be demonstrated and proven. If you're a priest and you look out at the sanctuary on Sunday morning, 99% of the folk there are going to be seated with people from one or two categories. My family are people about my age. We hang out with people we understand. People who understand us hang out with us. Family are people about my own age. What Strauss and Howe observed is that we develop a natural ease with people about our own age because we were at the same developmental stages at about the same time when major historical events begin to shape us. I have done an exercise probably 75 times across the United States where with groups like this, I ask people to organize themselves into generations. I give them the proverbial butcher paper and magic markers, and I say one question: what shaped your generation? Without exception, in my experience, they come back with crazy the same results. They list historical events, cultural movements, technological developments. And here's the kicker. All of them list those 3 categories that occurred to them before they were about 25. There is an intrinsic understanding, it's an instinctive understanding that we are shaped early in our lifespan. So, when you ask somebody who's 80, where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor, that really makes a difference. They understand that. When they're people who were about the same age as Pearl Harbor understand things about reality that people of other ages understand in a different way. Guess what? It's the same thing's true for the JFK assassination. Same thing's true for the Iranian hostage crisis. Same thing's true for the Challenger explosion. Same thing's true for 9/11. We hang out with people about our own age because we understand them, and we understand them because we went through at the same developmental psychological stages the same external stimuli. Makes common sense. Therefore, if you want to understand other people, you've got to understand what they've been through. In understanding the past, we anticipate the future. And you've heard that old adage that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. It actually doesn't stand up philosophically, but it does say something to us about understanding things that have happened so that we might learn from them in order to be wiser in our own age. And we could spend, especially those of you who spend a lot of time with Scripture, enormous time on this point. You know, the Christian story is a cosmology. It is an explanation for all that is. And it says that all that is because God made it that way. There was a time when there was no time and no matter. Then through the Big Bang we have the created order, and then in due time human beings and the human family with whom God covenants. In due time God sends the incarnate part of God's self to us in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is dead, buried, resurrected. We say the same Apostles' Creed, the third day, and that in due time it will all be brought together to its full completion. Beginning, middle, end. Time is a straight line. Time serves a purpose. Time's going somewhere. And in fact, someone once said that the Hebrew people gave to world culture the first time observation and a profound observation that because there was one God commanding things from beginning, middle to end, history has a purpose. It's not just one damn thing after another. That's a profound and then extraordinarily unusual observation. And yet, how many times have you gone to a funeral service or memorial and heard read Ecclesiastes? For everything there is a season. Time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap. It's very much a circular view of history. For everything in appointed time. Even within Scripture, there is this dynamic conversation about the nature of time. Well, think about that. If time's a straight line, and if time's a circle, which is it? Well, it's a spiral. It's a spiral. And any liturgical people, like Presbyterians and Episcopalians, will understand that naturally. Advent, Christmastide, Epiphany, Pentecost. We all get that because we understand that even within this orderly progression of God's movement in time, that there are cycles that human beings can note. All of which raises a very interesting question. Someone really, maybe there's someone here who will do this, will go back through Scripture and put together the generational theory for all of the scriptural family. Now, the living generations, yes? They weren't skipped, it was reversed. And right now I can't remember which of the types. I'd have to go back to by Strauss and Howe. I don't remember which one was reversed. It was the Civil War that was the time, but I forget which of the types of generations reversed order. In the last century, the civic generation was the GI generation. Anyone remember what GI stands for? Government issue or general issue. A civic generation is one in which it is a compliment to be called a regular guy, a normal person, an everyday person who fits in. A civic generation, by its own nature, would tend to say that your goal in life is to fit in. That individual characteristics and expression come after belonging to the group. And because a civic generation does things in big number and does them together, the civic generation tends to make huge dents and contributions to history. That's why Tom Brokaw called this generation, born between 1901 and 1924, the And let me tell you, most folk in that generation are glad to own that title. Strauss and Howell says that they say this very beautifully, I think, that members of this generation are the likeliest to see other generations as ineffectual facsimiles of their own. So the GI generation, the civic generation born between 1901 and 1924 is followed by the silent generation born 1925 to 1942. their children by and large. A note here about boxes. This is an historiography. It's an attempt to see order and sequence over all of time and all people. It is therefore a humanitarian's nightmare. There will be ways in which you do not fit and your family does not fit, and that's okay. If you walk out thinking you can't do this, you can't make any grand generalization about generalizations this way, fair enough. But give it a hearing, and remember it's not intended to describe everyone. Interestingly enough, the book after America, the Generations, the History of America's Future, they wrote another book called The Fifth Turning, which takes this same understanding of generations back to Rome, to history of all Western civilization. So they're convinced that there's something really to this. The silent generation called silent not because they were quiet, but because they're fewer in number than either the generation before them or after them. Followed by the next idealist generation. The last idealist generation in American history included Thoreau. Idealists tend to be individualistic. They want first to know who they are and to express that, and only secondarily to belong to groups. They are not, as a generation, joiners. They prize art and poetry over science and technology. And the baby boomers born after, you know why they're called the boom, there was a great burst in birth rates after World War II, fueled in large part by returning GIs and then a growing population and the economic boat rising and post-war security. You'll notice, too, that they say, Strauss and Howe, that the birth year for the boomer ends in 1960. Many demographers will put the baby boom up until 1963 or 1964. I think Strauss and Howe are right, and I think they're right based on purely anecdotal personal experience. I have 3 older siblings who are all baby boomers, and I love them dearly, but they're all weird. I knew my whole life, I'm really different from them. And if any of you know Doug, you can tell him I said so. Furthermore, you can tell him I can prove it. But what Strauss and Howe found is that you experience enormous social shifts even over a single 12 or 18-month period that demarks the beginning of a new set of people. So it's not measured by birth rates only, it's really measured by a much broader understanding of what's going on in the culture and the time. My generation, the 13er generation, is also called the Xer generation, born between 1961 and 1981. And we're also called sometimes the busters. We don't like that, because if you think the generation gap in the 1960s, which was between the GIs and the boomers, was a profound generation gap, the generation gap between the boomers and the Xers is even more profound. So to be called busters in the eye of a buster would be to be diminished, to be identified only in relationship to those who have come in the immediate generation before you. We are a reactive generation. Now, a word about these words. You can think of it this way. The primary generations are really civic and idealist because they're diametrically opposed. They stand for really very different things. The 2 generations between them are really buffer generations, adaptive and reactive. Really, it's time's way of healing the excesses of the 2 preceding generations. You've heard the old adage that grandchildren correct the excesses of their grandparents. That's the old folk way of saying what Strauss and Howe can demonstrate. So, if Strauss and Howe are right, beginning in 1982, there came a new generation who, believe it or not, would remember Joseph. Another civic generation. And the cycle repeats. That's the basic set of ideas. Now, I want to see who's here. If you're a member of the GI generation, would you raise your hand? If we did this 15 years ago, we would still have had a good number of GIs in the room. In my experiences, is that the conversation's very different when GIs are in the room. Normally because we're reverential and respectful of people who are older anyway, but also because there is, even if we have mixed feelings, there is also a sense of debt and gratitude to the GI generation. Without GIs present, the conversation might be a bit more terse. We'll see. If you're a member of the silent generation, would you raise your hand? So a handful of silence. If you're a member of the baby boom generation, raise your hand. If you're a member of the Gen X, would you raise your hand? And if you are a millennial, raise your hand. All right. Yeah. Now, you may not have noticed that our millennial friend in the back did not raise one hand, but raised two. Generations theory in action in our midst. A generational experience. What I got interested in was how this affected church life. And got to thinking, if I were to put together quadrants of church life, if I could understand what was making people tick based on their generational experience. So I put together, just for my own personal use to begin with, just on scratch paper, I would put grids, and I would say, let's look at worship. And then I would say, in my columns, I would say GIs and silents and boomers and Xers, and then millennials. And then I'd say, what is it about worship that I'd like to think about? Well, music, preaching style, translation of the text, when music is held, etc. And then I began just to write things in my own little personal boxes, and I realized this is really useful. My own tradition is less liturgical than yours, but it's not free worship either. It's a mixture. So what I did then in 3 subsequent congregations was to say, we're going to teach everybody about what everyone else is expecting from worship. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to have 6 successive worship services where we take one generation's experiences from their formative years and recreate their worship service. So for the GIs, we read from the King James Version of the Bible. We had no printed bulletin because they had, early in their lives, no printed bulletin. The pastor in my tradition wore no robe because it would have looked too Catholic. No lay people would have participated in the leadership of the worship service. We put these handmade song boards up. Remember those? We're in 323. We read from the Psalter from the back of the hymnal. We said these and thous. The next Sunday then, we did silence. And suddenly it was the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. The pastor was in a robe. And a lay person actually walked into the chancel and had a role in the worship service. You get the idea? So that when we get to the 13ers, it's completely different. Then we came back and we recreated the regular Sunday worship service to show everyone there that each portion of that worship service was specifically designed to meet the traditional expectations of somebody in that room. And that therefore, you can have a gentleness of spirit when something's going on that doesn't float your boat. Then I applied that to every area of church life, organizational life. How do we staff committees? When do those committees meet? What do those committees do? Do you have to be on a committee for 1 year? Can you be on a committee for 1 month? Et cetera, et cetera. And then I did it for each of the organizations within the church. Did it for education. And I did it for stewardship. And I think in no area of my generation studies was this more relevant than with the areas of stewardship. So, what we're going to spend the next time doing is thinking about money experiences from each generation's perspective. And because I simply don't have time to do each generation individually, we're going to cluster these 2 generations, the silent and the GIs, and the boomers and the 13ers. All right? Also, I want to remind you, I have another handout that I'm not ready to give to you yet because I know from experience that when I hand it out, your eyes go elsewhere. So I'll give it to you at the end, but it is a 1-page, 11 by 17 summary of everything I'm about to say. And I'll give it to you on the way out. So, let's think about the early experiences of money and stewardship from the GI and the silent generations. First off, they were trained from childhood. In the Presbyterian world, the church bulletin still said the giving of God's tithes. Even at the depth of the Great Depression, they brought their nickels to put in the milk box on the Sunday school table. Now, this is stunning. I got really interested in this, and turns out denominations have been keeping records for a very, very long time. If you look at giving to the church as a percentage of annual income, in the 11 primary mainline Protestant denominations in the United States and Canada, or their predecessors, 1933 marked the depth of the Great Depression. It also marked the highest percentage giving in the 85 years to follow. The less they had, the more they gave. What is it about the human soul that the less we have, the more we give, and statistically speaking, the more we have, the less we give? Now, that's demonstrable. That's news to no one. And I can show you research data from last year that shows that as a percentage of income, waitresses gave more than CEOs. Still true. So when I say these people were trained from childhood, I mean they had it modeled from their parents that belonging to a church carried with it responsibility and duty. Note, by the time we get to the boomers, we're not going to be using responsibility and duty as motivators for giving money. Doesn't work. Does not resonate. So they gave nickels and dimes in the milk box. They were first fruits givers. Let me not assume that everyone understands what that means. I have a wonderful friend who is a recent graduate of Princeton Seminary and a Presbyterian minister who did not know the words tithe, pledge, or give, or know how to distinguish them. It's no longer the assumption that people have been raised knowing basic concepts of Christian gratitude and sharing. So we have to cover them. By first fruits, I mean the practice biblically, which begins in the Old Testament, of giving a percentage of one's harvest upon that harvest. First fruits. So we're told in the Old Testament that God's people were commanded to do two things: to give off of the top and to give the best. That's what was commanded. So by first fruits, we mean people who still continue to do that, whether through their annual income or whether through accumulated assets. And this generation, these generations are still by far the most likely to do this. The folks who just simply say, I've given a paycheck for $3,000, 300 of it's going to church and charity. That's the way they work. They are the likeliest to be pledgers. And you all know what a pledger is. A pledger is one who says, I intend in this coming year to give the church this amount of money. I've had people in the past say to me, preacher, I don't pledge. And if I know them well enough, I say, well, do you have a mortgage? And do you have a car payment? Well, yeah. So what you mean is you do pledge, you just don't pledge to God. Now, I have to know them really well. But the truth is the truth. And when I use that word disciplined generosity, that's what I mean. We really cannot discipline ourselves or to benefit from the discipline of sharing unless we say in advance, I intend to do this. And I know economic matters may change and I may have to adjust upwards or downwards. But at this point, this is what I intend to do. People who are willing to sign the dotted line and make their own personal promise to God as evidence that they're giving to the church, likeliest in these two generations. And they're likeliest to be tithers. You know what a tither is? A tither is one who gives. The biblical tithe was 10%. There's a great argument among scholars and preachers about whether or not tithing is still instructive for the Christian church. They point out that Jesus doesn't mention it per se, that it would be too legalistic, and I think they're right. I think Jesus would say 10% is a good starting place. And of course, we make it the goal. People say, well, I don't know, preacher, just doing 1% this year. Well, try 2 next year. Set a goal, grow into it. Be honest in your family about whether or not you're growing spiritually because of your own generosity. And then go to 3, and then to 4, and then to 5. And then they say, well, 10%, Karl, is that gross or net? If I know them really well, I say, use the figure you give the bank, not the IRS. If I know them really well. If I don't know them really well, I say, you get to 10% of net and then see how you feel and you make that decision. I personally know of no one who hasn't made it to 10% of net who hasn't gone on. 10% of gross, and 10.5%, and 11%. I see it too often. It is good for us to give. The people likeliest to hear what I just said as graceful and as a recommendation from a pastor who's trying to live what he preaches, the people who are going to hear that okay are the GIs in the silence. Now, unless I miss my guess, there's some baby boomer hogwash meter pegging going on. You do realize hogwash is a euphemism. So let me give you a chance, let you give me a chance, please, to convince you otherwise. And for these folks, giving is a public responsibility. It's a necessity. We just give because that's what you do. This is a generation by far most willing to say, this is what my parents taught me to do. They handed to me the tradition. I practice the tradition. I hand on the tradition to my children, unchallenged and unchanged. Their attitude of trust toward the institutional church. I suspect that I know your denomination is as rancorous as mine, and that we are at the cusp of what at least some are saying a 500-year sea change in Christian history, that we are involved in dynamic times, but also conflicted and difficult times. So the institutional church is in and of itself a touchy topic. The attitude toward these folks, toward the institutional church, was one of great trust. Now remember, this is the generation that saw the development of large government and its beneficiaries. This was the generation that saw the Great Depression and all of the Depression-era programs early in their lifespan. So the CCC and the WPA and the NRA, all of those organizations, and the TVA, that alphabet soup of government stands for those generations as a symbol that government is not in fact evil, but that government is for us, by us, and with us, and can help us solve our own problems. Government is a tool, among others, for good. This was a generation that, through large organizational efforts, fought the world and made it safe for democracy. That because it did things big and did things together, took the power of the atomic bomb and put it in a bomb, and then in a submarine, and then in a power plant. This was a generation that was supremely confident because it thought that it could throw people and resources at any problem and conquer them. This was a generation of Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry, who believed above all things that things just keep getting better, and that the human being, human society, the human race will actually, just as any individual human being, continue to progress until someday we won't need private property and we'll fly amongst the stars and practice the Supreme Directive. What is it? Any Star Trekkies here? The Prime Directive. See what I'm talking about? You know that. It's so much a part of us. That was the supreme confidence of this generation. Succeeding generations will come along and point out that, the last century proves we didn't get much better. When the last century began and ended in Sarajevo, hard to argue that human beings made much progress. But for this generation, the can-do generation, the do things in a big way generation, they really believed this. And so for them, there we go. The church was a part of that cosmic order. The church as an institution should be trusted. I give my money to the church. I've had members of this generation say, I give my money to the church. What the church does with it, it's the church's business. You'll never hear that from a baby boomer. For them, the church mirrored and symbolized the established order of things. For them, the church is the repository of inherited faith and also their entrance into social belonging. This is a generation of joiners who, if they moved, the first thing they did was go and find a new church. In later years, this church has not been above a critique for them. Let's not paint them as universal in their appreciation for the church. For them, the meaning of money is security. And if any of us had been through the Depression, wouldn't it be for us also? When you saw the plant foreman who then became the milkman, and you saw people lose their earnings and their life nest eggs, wouldn't you think that money is security? Gil Rendell talks about, in his book that will be on a bibliography that you'll get in a bit, he talks about this wonderful story about the boomer pastor who is serving a church when the sanctuary burns. The GI generation had long ago began putting money away for an endowment, and I'll forget the exact numbers, but my memory is about $600,000 in the account for the rainy day. The church building burns. Insurance will take care of all of the rebuilding, but about $150,000. the boomer pastor assumes that they'll pull that $150,000 from the rainy day fund. Goes to the session meeting, our version of your vestry. He and all of the other baby boomers have made the same assumption. The GIs say, but we can't spend that money, it's for a rainy day. And they say, the sanctuary is gone. What constitutes rain? But what's going on in that conversation is an authentic conversation about the meaning of money. For that generation, money is security. And if there's less of it in the bank, I'm less secure. For boomers, the meaning of money is a means of exchange. It's a way that I get experiences and objects. Money serves a different function for those groups. Now, seriously, if you were at that meeting of the session of the vestry and you knew what was really making the conversation go round, wouldn't that be a nice bit of information to be able to have? The stewardship descriptor, I might even say motivator, especially for those of you who are priests. By the way, who's a priest, a preacher in here? Okay. You cannot preach one stewardship sermon a year and think that it's going to land well for all these generations. You've got to preach stewardship year-round. If you were to preach a stewardship sermon for that one generation, the word that would have to be there is sacrifice. They understand what it means to sacrifice. As opposed to a friend of mine who does financial consulting for congregations was recently told by a congregation with whom she was interviewing, well, we didn't hire you because you used the word sacrifice. Primarily a baby boomer generation, and they heard that as a negative word. For the GIs, it's a positive word. For the silents, the word is commitment. And that, again, portrays their understanding of the institutions that their parents gave to them. Their parents built large institutions, and by the way, highly centralized national denominations, and gave those congregations, denominations to their children, and they were committed to them. One's mark of faithfulness is measured by your measure of commitment to the institution. I can illustrate that. My mom and dad are quintessential silent generation folk. Grew up in a small town in Texas, the local son of the Presbyterian minister, and at 16 years of age, I came home with alcohol on my breath. And my mother said, I'm telling your father. That was a Saturday night. So Sunday I waited. And Monday I waited. And Tuesday I waited. And he didn't mention it. Another Sunday and another Sunday, weeks went by. And I thought, yeah. And he called me into the living room one day when I was walking by, and he said, I understand that you want to make the varsity football team as a sophomore. Let's talk about teamwork and what your teammates have a right to request of you. We talked about behaviors that were committed to the team and behaviors that were inconsistent with commitment to the team. And do you know, I was in college before I realized that was the alcohol talk. Through his eyes, it wasn't about the use of alcohol, it was about failing in my commitment to the team. That's the way it is with church with this generation. Understand that that's what they're about, covenant and commitment. You understand what makes them tick. And for these folks, money followed mission. My father, who is my model for ministry and in most ways my model for manhood, still to this day believes that the way to raise money in the church is to get everybody together and have everybody dream about what the church would do next year if only we had the money. That money follows the mission. That what really makes people's hearts go pitter-patter is knowing what they're going to do together, and then they'll reach deep and write checks. And you know what? He's right for his generation. How the church can encourage good stewardship among GIs and silents. Let's review some definitional stuff. Every stewardship committee in the world should have a simple job description, and that is to accompany fellow disciples in the life of that parish in becoming more generous stewards. That's about money, but it's also about time, and it's also about treasure, and to these days it also has to be about the earth. So we could say that it's the 4 T's of stewardship: time, talent, treasure, and terra firma. We've got to care for the earth. But the definition of the stewardship committee is to raise consciousness so that we're walking alongside one another as we grow together in generosity. So, what can we do to encourage good stewardship for these folks? Well, first off, they need help with estate planning, as you might guess. Fear management. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. You head into retirement and you've only got so much, and of course you need help with fear management. We need to encourage GIs in silence to share their experiences and values and to allow a new stewardship conversation. I can illustrate that with my first congregation, 85% over the age of 65, over the age of 65. It had been formed in a local community where there had once upon a time been only one Presbyterian church. It was the downtown steeple. And in the 60s, a group of people had experienced their stewardship efforts as violating and intrusive and heavy-handed. And in large part because they didn't like those particular stewardship methods, they had formed another Presbyterian church. It was the one I was called to serve. And so for the next 35 years, they had never once asked for a pledge card. They lived on the faith budget. And they would say, we've always had what we needed, and if the air conditioner goes out, we'll just ask and people will give to it. That's how they'd operated. Young couples started to come with their children. We didn't have room for church school. We needed to build a building. No banker lends a church money on faith. You've got to have pledges. So they were also saying to me at the same time, you know, these 30-somethings, they're not giving the way we did when we were younger. And I said, well, you don't allow us to talk about stewardship. So I asked for a major change. I said, we're going to take pledges, receive pledges for the capital campaign. Now is the time to begin receiving pledges for the annual operating budget. And let me please teach about stewardship. And for that to happen, we called a congregational meeting, and I asked the then 13 remaining founding members who had been so resolutely against ever receiving a pledge card, if they wouldn't stand up and admit the times had changed and that we needed to, and all 13 of them did. And our annual operating budget jumped 40% in 1 year. But you know what really drove the point home? Is I asked them to tell their stories. And Marvin Bird, a farmer in Illinois, at D-Day +2, vessels sunk, spends the night in the cold and icy waters. A Canadian vessel picks him up the next day to keep him from frostbite and to keep his mind off of it. They give him a bottle of vodka. It's the only time in his life he was ever drunk. Viva had no idea if he was alive. Came back, he had asthma. You can't be an Illinois farmer with asthma. So sight unseen, they went to Roswell, New Mexico, with 2 sons thereafter, and he got a job in a local hardware store, and they pledged a tithe, the full 10% of his income, and he lost his job, and they kept their pledge. There was no need for me to preach stewardship that year, because Marvin Bird told that story, and he'd never told it before. And do you know the stories of Christian witness and testimony on this subject that are quickly passing away from us, that are going untold because we simply haven't asked? These folks need to be encouraged to tell their stories. Now let's go to the baby boomer and the 13er generations. By the way, I have no idea what schedule we're working on. What time are we supposed to be done? Does anyone know? Lance? 12:30? All right. Well, we're good. The baby boomer and the 13ers. Now remember, these are folks born between 1942 and 1960 and 1961 to 1981. Baby boomers know this better than I do. But a seismic shift happens between the GIs and the baby boomers. The GIs trust institutions. The baby boomers abhor institutions. The GIs have a positive feeling about belonging to a group. Boomers are suspicious about belonging to a group. Remember, we're shaped early in our lifespan. How could it be different for baby boomers? Baby boomers' early lives weren't marked by the NRA and the Social Security Administration and the GI Bill. They weren't marked by large military successes on the beaches of Normandy or across Japan. They were marked instead by Vietnam and Cambodia. They were begun with the Gary Powers incident, in which a president of the United States, the vaulted leader of the GI generation, is caught lying to the international community. And from then on, let us see about how trustworthy institutions are. Whereas a former generation could start working for Ford Motor Company and 40 years later leave with a banquet and a watch, the GIs knew from early on in their lifespan that corporations could not be trusted to provide them lifetime employment. And then there were questions about how corporations conducted themselves. The Firestone 500, the Pinto, which has shown conclusively that American corporations are using cost-benefit analysis to litigate, to save them, to comparing the cost of litigation when people die from the use of their products versus the cost to go back and do it right anyway. Think about it. Watergate? How could a generation that was formed in that time trust institutions? Then we have the civil rights movements, feminist liberation movements. We see institutions recoiling and rebuffing basic human efforts to make life more fair in a country whose constitution says it's supposed to be. How could this generation help but be suspicious of institutions? And how could this generation help but be suspicious of churches that preached a gospel that in many ways clearly it was not yet living into? Now, am I describing the boomer reality, those of you who are boomers? So the boomers are going to be motivated by, guess what, a very different sense of things, particularly considering that economically speaking, they had it pretty good as kids. And it had in fact been their parents' and grandparents' greatest effort to make sure that they had it pretty good as kids. Do you know what percentage of baby boomers ever spent any time in institutional child care? 2%. Ward and June Cleaver, that's not idyllic in many ways. That represented reality for a lot of families. Baby boomers have a different approach to money, no surprise. They were born into the post-war economic boom and the world of upward mobility. They also experienced something that has changed the human soul, and I will argue it to my death. And that's television. You'll see on the bibliography, I'll give you in a little bit, a book by a woman named Juliet Schor, Why We Want What We Do Not Need. It's titled, that's the subtitle, it's titled The Overspent American. And Juliet Schor goes back to point out any number of things that have made us want things we don't really need. Television is one of the primary culprits. Television advertising is one of the primary culprits on television. And what advertisers have done is change our scope of reference. It used to be in pre-war communities that people lived pretty much with one another, and the banker lived next to the preacher, lived next to the plumber. And you'll see in pre-war real estate that you'll have grand homes next to more modest homes. It's in the post-war years that real estate developers begin to give us neighborhoods segmented by income and the capacity to pay for a home. So Pheasant Ridge, homes from the 210s, right? In which people of like economic ability live next to one another. But in 1947, when American televisions first began to be sold, everyone knew it would be the banker and the lawyer to get one first. There was an economic pecking order. But in 2011, when you're watching the Super Bowl, that Mercedes is being advertised to the banker and the plumber at the same time. And our scope of reference, our means of comparison, how we're supposed to feel about ourselves, because aren't we made for production and consumption? That's the modern myth. You matter because you buy. You matter because you participate in the economic wheels of production and consumption. You matter because you have a large house, or a shiny car, or a nice wardrobe. And you really matter if you've got a very complicated 1040. That's the myth. And into that myth comes the Christian gospel, which says something absolutely antithetical to modern understandings of the purpose for human beings, which says simply, you matter because you breathe. And you are infinitely valuable no matter how much you own, produce, consume, or acquire. You matter because you breathe. We began years ago in the churches I served when we baptized, adding one anointing. And we just simply on the foreheads of all the children as we baptize them say, you are a child of God, sealed by the Holy Spirit, and marked as Christ forever, and nothing anyone ever says or does can make that not true. And so I began doing that with my kids at home, nighttime, morning, and all. And I've got a kid who's 16 going on 30. There was a time when she was 7 going on 13. And I reached out one night to put the cross on her forehead, and I said, "You are a child of God." And she said, I know, sealed by the Holy Spirit, marked as Christ forever. But she knew it. She knew it. And there will come a time in the classroom or in the ball field or at the shopping mall or in the back seat, and I want those words to be embedded in her soul. So when they got their phones and we began texting, I began to just a daily ritual. U-R-A-C-O-G. No spaces. U-R-A-C-O-G. You are a cog. U-R-A-C-O-G. And that's our ritual every day. Because let us not forget that part of the stewardship conversation is giving people the Christian gospel antithesis to what the world teaches them they're for. Why they matter. Why they're here. Now, notice I've shifted to something that's highly personal. I'm not talking about the church, and I'm not talking about the missionaries that we're going to send to Africa, and I'm not talking about the underpaid priest. I'm talking about something basic about human beings and why they matter and why we should care. Remember that, because that's where all stewardship conversations should begin these days. This generation experienced television and the change scope of influence, experienced the rapid growth of the stock market, and then they experienced the growing disparity between the rich and the poor. I don't have to tell any of you folk that we are now reaching a point of disparity between rich and poor unequaled since the last Gilded Age. And I'm not being political to observe that it cannot continue. Periods in American history have seen a retrenchment of traditional economic values when this has happened. It can't continue. Now, let's talk about baby boomers and 13ers' early experiences of stewardship. Is it safe to say in the Episcopal Church that baby boomers and 13ers have had a spotty experience of stewardship education? Is it? Here's my theory. My theory, at least in the Presbyterian world, is that somewhere about 30 years ago, we stopped talking about stewardship because the GIs and the silents knew it so well, they didn't need to hear it, and frankly, we're kind of tired of it. And so we just stopped talking about it. And when we stopped talking about basic words, first fruit givers, and pledging, and tithing, and giving, and the joys of giving, and the responsibilities of giving, and how that's part of our Christian obedience and our walk with Jesus Christ, we just stopped talking about that in large part. And so many of our GIs, many of our baby boomers and 13ers have just never heard it. It literally is a new conversation. And every fall, every autumn, when we enter a stewardship season in my congregation, we literally include in our bulletin a glossary of stewardship definitions. I cannot assume any longer that people know what those words mean. Many come from unchurched backgrounds, so stewardship is a new conversation. Now, we have to nuance this for our audiences because Presbyterians and Episcopalians are alike in so many ways. Most of my folk did not grow up Presbyterian. Most of them have come from more conservative Christian traditions, and they've come to Presbyterianism because they're seeking a way that will provide spiritual growth. And they would say, not my words, I want, please don't to appear arrogant, but they would say they want to come to a place where they go deeper. Now, unless I miss my guess, that's the experience of most of your parishes. So many of our folks who have been de-churched and are coming back, or coming from other theological traditions, if they've come from more conservative traditions, may really know stewardship pretty well. And the interesting thing in my congregation is that when I have newcomers who come from Baptist Church of Christ congregational backgrounds who know stewardship, it makes me embarrassed to compare them to the level of their Presbyterian cohorts in the same congregation because we haven't taught it. Well, we're changing that where I serve, and I bet you do well and can in your future as well. And these folks have been taught that giving is a personal option, it's a personal possibility, but it's not a public necessity. Do I need to illustrate? I will tell you how most baby boomers and Xers make charitable giving decisions. If, after I've paid my bills, and if, after I've had some fun, And if you get my attention long enough so that we can have the conversation, and if you can convince me that the work of your institution really matters, and if you can promise me that the money I give will go to where I want it, and if you can assure me that I will have a personal, emotional connection to the recipients of that money, then I might give you some. Now, do you think that's an exaggeration? We have every one of those hurdles to clear with boomers and extras in our pews. If. Which is why that you realize we can't do that. You cannot leap 6 ifs on the way to maybe. There has to be another way to do this. By the way, someone was saying to me the other day, boy, you know, NPR does a great job fundraising. And I know every one of you has an NPR affiliate in your neighborhood where they're raising that money. 2 points about that. They do raise the dollars, but the use of guilt language is incredible. I love NPR and give it to NPR, but I don't listen to NPR during the pledge drive. If I use that language from the pulpit, I would be called an autocratic Presbyterian preacher. I just don't do it. But I love NPR, give it to NPR. If I won the lottery, most of it would go to NPR. I think NPR does great things for our nation. But, pardon? Yes. Yeah. You know, by the way, that raises an interesting question. People ask me that. You know, 10%. Is that all to the church, or can I include the American Cancer Society? And my answer to that is that people of conscience will reach different conclusions on that matter. However, for me, I have made the decision that the church receives my tithe. And the reason for that is overtly theological. The church is not another one of those institutions in the world. It's the body of Jesus Christ. And because of that, I see it differently from all of those other voluntary associations, which is not to say they don't do amazing things. They do. It is to say that to be a worshiping Christian and to be involved by baptismal covenant and response and grace to the covenant community means certain things about how I see the world. So that means I give very little to other organizations, and my tithe goes to the church. Now, I really can see how other people reach different conclusions, and that's okay. But as for me and my house, you know, we will choose to serve the Lord. Yeah.
I actually said, and you can give more than 10%. You can do 10% of the church and everything above.
Yeah. Did you hear that? 10% to the church and everything above. So, that's basically what I've done. Yeah. Baby boomer and 13 generations, the attitude toward the institutional church is distrust, if not disgust. This is how I think of this. And I think this is true for the Episcopal Church as well as the Presbyterian Church. The generations that preceded them received the church as a tradition, as a set of concepts and rituals that they passed on untouched to the next generation because that's what one does. Baby boomers came along and critiqued everything. And no ritual, and no assumption, no conviction, and certainly no institution should be perpetuated simply because that's the way it's done. So baby boomers changed, challenged, moved. And statistically speaking, baby boomers left the Episcopal and Presbyterian churches. Statistically speaking. That so many of folk in those generations who were raised as young Episcopalians did not remain Episcopalians into their adulthoods, right? So we're faced with a reality that in many of our parishes, we have baby boomers, fewer and fewer baby boomers, and then fewer and fewer extras. And when young folks really do give us a shot, they come in ready to go. But most vestries have seen so little change in the last 30 years because it's the young generally that encourage change. So when younger folks come in and start demanding change, it feels to them like you're going at a snail's pace, but it feels to GIs in silence like you're moving at breakneck pace. Because it's been so long since so many of our parishes have made substantive change. Yes? Oh, absolutely.
Because during this same time is when all the corruption and things that happened in the church became public as well.
That's exactly right.
It may not have been our churches, but,
That's absolutely right. There is in this nation at this time an uncritical anti-institutionalism that paints all institutions with the same brush. So no matter how trustworthy an institution, it is still going to be met at first glance with jaundice and cynicism. And that includes the church. And there's no doubt that includes the church. They are skeptical of stewardship if it's presented about the institution's health. So if we talk about, well, you know, if we don't have more money, this church is really not going to be what it was. Big deal. Are you serving Jesus Christ? Are you making a difference in the world? Are you giving people tools for vibrant discipleship out there in the community? That's the measure. But just because there's been a church at the corner of 5th and Elm for all these years, that's no reason to continue it. And that really is a baby boomer approach. For what it's worth, I think Xers, 13ers, are not nearly so constitutionally anti-institutional. What I mean by that is boomers really distrust institutions to the core. Xers will give an institution, including a church, a chance. Really will. They don't presume that it will fail. But there are a couple of measures. One, does it tell the truth? And two, does it do what it says it's going to? And that's a high standard, easily described. Does the institution, does the church tell the truth, and does it do what it says it's going to? These folks hold little denominational loyalty. Is it your experience that most of your newer members come from non-Anglican Episcopal traditions? Yeah. And 13er attitudes toward the institutional church, I've mentioned that they're not constitutionally anti-institutional. We'll trust the congregation if it works. And you know what research project after research project after research project says about Xers, what they're looking for. Remember that the extra childhood is in the 60s and 70s and 80s. There was one 6-year period in their childhood, our childhood, which the number of states with no-fault divorce laws went from 0 to 45. So divorce rates skyrocket. Just as the public willingness to pay for public education, Proposition 13, brings that to an abrupt end. When Hollywood stops making movies for children and starts making them about children, The Omen, Children of the Corn. When the generation then in its prime, the silent generation, is the generation that most frequently will say they wish they were part of another generation, and thereby fuel a youth-obsessed culture that means everything from more plastic surgery to more labels on bottles that say non-fat, non-nitrate, non-this, non-that, to flout what you're not consuming. You get it? Xers come along at a different time and really have, in many ways, a different kind of sensibility. And so all of that says high divorce rates, a generation of latchkey kids, high mobility because you can't trust that one job will be enough through an adult work life, and so you're moving around more. The breakup of traditional kinship networks after World War II, all of that stuff leads to a generation of folk who say, you know what I want is a family. I want a family. And that means a couple of things from which our churches benefit. First off, is often Xers don't know the word for it, but they're looking for liturgy. Not all of them. The megachurches are full. But there's a segment of those generation that says, I want something that reminds me that this is an activity in which my grandparents and theirs have practiced. So for that section of those generations, we really have a shot. They're looking for rootedness. We also have a tremendous advantage because for this generation, belonging precedes believing. First I belong, and then I believe. And let's face it, your worship is not user-friendly. Nor is Presbyterian worship, for that matter. But what that means is that when you get folk who are unchurched, dechurched, underchurched, or have just not been churched, you've got miles to go. But the benefit you have, that we have, is to help them belong. And if they belong, the belief will come. The meaning of money for baby boomers and 13ers is it's a tool. It's a means of exchange. The stewardship descriptor is distrust. And for us, mission must follow money. The formula is reversed. For baby boomers and 13ers, we need to earn their trust. And I'm going to say a whole lot more about that in our next section. If you start off with a group of people who simply are predisposed not to trust you, everything after that has to be about earning their trust and being trustworthy partners. To be a partner means that you're not dictatorial or authoritarian. To be a partner means that you do what you ask them to do. To be a partner means also that you share everything that you do. Our parishes must operate in complete transparency. When we do that, things turn out okay. It's when we get frightened and cloaked that we feed that anti-institutional distrust, when the hogwash meter pegs to 10 and they're out the door. Remember, they're out the door pretty easily because their commitment, baby boomers in particular, is the commitment of a consumer. I'll fly American Airlines as long as their frequent flyer program is better than Delta's. I'll be Episcopalian as long as we've brought consumer mentality to the religious marketplace. We do have to provide some control in giving, and I want to talk about that at greater length later, because in essence what I want to say in the next time is that we can no longer conduct stewardship annual campaigns the way we have. We can't do them one size fits all. We have to do a bunch of differing things all at the same time. One of the ways that we have to do that is to continue to encourage trust in the institution and unified giving, which is what we would call in the Presbyterian world. That idea that I give money to my congregation, to my parish, and the vestry then, made up of democratically elected representatives, makes decision on our behalf about how best to use that money to the glory of God. And that might mean an air conditioner, and it might mean a relationship with a Tanzanian missionary. Is central to either an Episcopal or a Presbyterian polity. So when I say provide control in giving, I'm offering a paradox. Because in some ways there will be none. And we have to just admit that. That's who we are as churches. The polity assumptions of either of our polities are that other people are going to be making for us decisions at some times.
And you're just asking them to get comfortable with that, or?
Well, I'm asking them to accept that and to understand it. And then I think we have to provide choice in giving. We're going to talk a lot about special offerings. And how many times do you go to the well? How many times do you pass the plates? What's reasonable to expect? And I have some pretty strong opinions, but I think I can pretty objectively give you both sides of those arguments. And then we have to educate because, many baby boomers began their faith journey in a time when congregations didn't teach stewardship. So again and again and again and again, that means a glossary of stewardship-related terms in worship bulletins. That means articles from priests in newsletters. That means sermons where you're covering basic information, where in the back of your mind you're thinking they don't know this, but you can't assume they do. By the way, those of you who don't preach regularly, you do know our greatest fear. That's the mental wall between what we think and what we say might be breached. It's our greatest fear. I really do that. Because I listen to my sermons sometimes, and I know it was a good sermon, and it's received lots of affirmation, and it's landed well, and I'm thinking to myself, what a bore. Because the stuff I already knew, right? So part of preaching is remembering that everybody doesn't know, and we've got to offer elementary information.